a sleep story for restful nights. The old pickup truck rattled along the coastal highway as the afternoon sun painted the Pacific Ocean in shades of amber and gold. Sarah Mitchell watched the waves roll in with a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. She'd driven nearly 400 miles from Portland, leaving behind the noise and hurry of the city for something she couldn't quite name yet. Peace, maybe, or perhaps just quiet. The realtor's voice crackled through her phone speaker, tinny but enthusiastic. "You're going to love Beacon's End, Miss Mitchell. It's the most charming little lighthouse on the Oregon coast. Built in 1892, completely renovated, but they kept all the original character. The keeper's cottage is just darling." Sarah smiled despite herself. She wasn't sure about darling, but she needed a change. 6 months as a temporary lighthouse keeper on a remote stretch of coastline seemed exactly right. No deadlines, no meetings, just the sea, the light, and time to figure out what came next. The highway curved inland, and she followed a narrow road marked by a weathered wooden sign. Beacon End, 3 miles. The pavement gave way to gravel, crunching beneath her tires. Douglas firs lined both sides, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on her windshield. She rolled down the window, and the air that rushed in carried the salt-sweet smell of the ocean mixed with pine and earth. It was cool and clean, nothing like the exhaust-tinged air of the city. Sarah breathed deeply, feeling something tight in her chest begin to loosen. The trees thinned, and suddenly there it was. Beacon's End Lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, its white tower rising 50 feet into the clear blue sky. The keeper's cottage sat beside it, a cozy structure of weathered shingles with a red door and flower boxes in the windows. Behind it all, the Pacific stretched to the horizon, vast and endless and utterly peaceful. Sarah parked and stepped out of the truck. The wind immediately caught her hair, playful and persistent. She could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below, a sound like distant thunder that never quite stopped. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their calls sharp and wild. For the first time in months, she felt something close to excitement. The cottage door was unlocked, just as the realtor had promised. Sarah pushed it open and stepped into a space that smelled of old wood and lemon polish. The interior was simple but welcoming, hardwood floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. A stone fireplace with a mantel crowded with old glass fishing floats in blues and greens. Windows everywhere, letting in the light and the endless view of the sea. The furniture was a comfortable mix of old and practical. A deep sofa covered in faded blue fabric faced the fireplace. A wooden table and chairs sat near the kitchen, which was small, but had everything she'd need. Upstairs, she found a bedroom tucked under the eaves, with a brass bed and a patchwork quilt, and a window that looked straight out at the ocean. Sarah unpacked slowly, taking her time, putting her books on the shelf and her clothes in the old oak dresser. There was no hurry. That was the whole point. As the sun began to set, she climbed the spiral stairs inside the lighthouse tower. Round and round, her footsteps echoing on the iron steps. At the top, the lamp room was all glass and light. The Fresnel lens, that marvel of 19th century engineering, sat quiet now. It would illuminate automatically at dusk, the realtor had explained. Solar powered these days with a backup generator. All very modern beneath the vintage exterior. Sarah stood at the gallery deck, the narrow walkway that circled the lamp room, and watched the sun sink toward the water. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep purple. The ocean reflected it all, a mirror of color and light. As the first stars appeared, the lighthouse lamp hummed to life behind her. Beginning its nightly vigil, she smiled. This was going to be good. Part 2. The first days, Sarah woke to gray light filtering through white curtains and the sound of rain pattering against the windows. She stretched beneath the quilt, warm and comfortable, in no rush to leave the bed. The rain had a rhythm to it, gentle and steady, and beneath it, she could still hear the waves. Eventually, she rose and padded downstairs in her slippers. The cottage was cool, so she lit a fire in the fireplace, watching the kindling catch and the flames begin to dance. While the coffee brewed, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the rain sweep across the ocean in silvery sheets. The days developed their own rhythm, slow and easy. Sarah walked the beach every morning, rain or shine, collecting smooth stones and bits of driftwood. The beach was often empty except for the shorebirds racing after retreating waves. Sometimes she'd see a Syl's dark head bobbing in the surf, watching her with curious eyes before disappearing beneath the surface. There was a small town, Anchor Bay, about 5 miles down the coast. She drove there twice a week for supplies. The grocery store was small but had everything she needed. The people were friendly in that reserved coastal way, polite but non-intrusive. The woman at the checkout, whose name tag read Betty, gave her a warm smile and said, "You must be the new keeper at Beacon's End. Welcome, dear. You need anything, you just let us know." Sarah bought fresh bread from the bakery and vegetables from a farm stand at the edge of town. She discovered a bookstore tucked down a side street, its windows filled with weathered paperbacks and local histories. The owner, an elderly man with white hair and half-moon glasses, recommended a book about shipwrecks along the Oregon coast. "Lots of history out there," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the ocean. "Beacon's End has seen its share. Good lighthouse, though. Saved many a ship in its day." Sarah bought the book and read it by the fire that evening, learning about storms and brave rescues and sailors who weren't so lucky. The lighthouse had a long history of faithful service, its light a constant in the darkness, a promise of safety and land. The duties of a modern lighthouse keeper were minimal. Check the automated systems daily, make sure the lens was clean, report any malfunctions to the Coast Guard, keep a logbook. It took perhaps an hour each day, leaving Sarah with vast stretches of time to fill however she chose. She read, she walked. She sat on the rocks and watched the ocean change with the weather and the tides. Sometimes it was calm as glass, barely moving. Other times it churned and roared, throwing spray 30 feet into the air. She started cooking again, something she'd stopped doing in the city when takeout was easier. She made soups and stews, bread and muffins, filling the cottage with warm smells. She ate slowly, savoring each meal, usually at the table by the window so she could watch the sea. At night, after the lighthouse lamp came on, she'd often climb the tower and sit in the lamp room, surrounded by slowly rotating light. The beam swept across the water every 15 seconds, reaching out into the darkness. It was hypnotic and peaceful, that steady rotation, that unwavering purpose. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Sarah was in the lamp room when she noticed a thick fog rolling in from the ocean. It came quickly, erasing the horizon, then the waves, then the rocks below. Within minutes, the lighthouse stood in a world of white. The foghorn, triggered automatically, began its deep, mournful song. Every 30 seconds, a long, low note that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Sarah stood at the glass, watching the beam of light lance through the fog, a pale shaft in the grayness. Somewhere out there, sailors would see it or hear the horn and know where the rocks were, know they were safe. The thought pleased her. Even automated, even alone, the lighthouse still served its purpose. The fog lasted 3 days. It was like living inside a cloud. The world shrank to just the lighthouse and cottage, suspended in whiteness. Sounds became muffled and strange. The foghorn called its warning endlessly, day and night, a deep voice speaking to the unseen. Sarah found she didn't mind. There was something intimate about it, being tucked away in the fog. She read 3 books, baked 2 loaves of bread, and spent long hours simply sitting and thinking about nothing in particular. When the fog finally lifted, the world seemed almost too bright and sharp. But the ocean sparkled in the sunshine, and Sarah walked down to the beach, glad to stretch her legs and feel unimpeded wind on her face. Part 3. Discoveries in the cottage's small study. Sarah found a collection of old logbooks, dating back decades. Previous keepers had recorded weather conditions, ship sightings, maintenance work, and occasional personal observations. The handwriting changed from book to book, different keepers with different styles, but the care was always evident. One keeper, a man named Thomas Wright, who'd served from 1967 to 1982, had beautiful handwriting, each letter precisely formed. He noted wind speeds and barometric pressure with scientific precision, but also wrote little observations. Saw a pod of gray whales heading north today. Town at 12, including 2 calves. Magnificent creatures, or first roses blooming in the garden. Martha would have left them. Another keeper, Helen Torres, had served in the 1990s. Her entries were brief and practical, but Sarah noticed she'd sketched in the margins sometimes. Little drawings of birds, shells, a seal sunning on the rocks. Sarah started her own logbook, continuing the tradition. At first, she kept it simple. Weather, tide times, any maintenance she performed. But gradually, she began adding more, following Thomas Wright's example. She wrote about the osprey that nested on a rocky outcropping and brought fish back for its young. About the spectacular sunset when the sky turned colors she didn't have names for. About the way the rain sounded different depending on the wind direction. One afternoon, while exploring the cottage's small basement, Sarah found a wooden crate tucked in a corner. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some quite old. Black and white images of the lighthouse from different eras. Keepers and their families standing by the red door. Children playing on the rocks. A wedding photo, the bride and groom framed by the lighthouse tower. She brought them upstairs and spread them on the kitchen table, studying faces from the past. These people had lived here, had climbed these same stairs, had watched the same ocean. The thought connected her to them in a way she hadn't expected. There was one photo that particularly caught her attention. It showed a woman standing at the gallery deck, one hand shading her eyes as she looked out to sea. The photo was old, probably from the 1940s, based on the woman's clothing. Something about her posture, the way she stood so still and watchful, resonated with Sarah. She propped the photo on the kitchen windowsill, wanting to keep it close. The garden that Thomas Wright had mentioned was still there, though overgrown. Sarah found it behind the cottage, protected from the worst of the wind by a weathered fence. Roses, as he'd noted, but also lavender and sage, and other hardy plants that didn't mind salt air. She began working on it, pulling weeds, cutting back the overgrowth. The work was satisfying, her hands in the soil, the sun on her back. As she gardened, she often thought about Martha, Thomas Wright's wife, presumably. Had they tended this garden together? Had they been happy here in this remote place? Sarah found herself wondering about all the keepers who'd come before. What had brought them here? What had they found? Had they loved it as she was beginning to, or had they felt isolated and lonely? One evening, she drove into Anchor Bay and stopped at the local library, a small building near the harbor. The librarian, a woman about Sarah's age with kind eyes and curly hair, seemed delighted to have a visitor. "I'm doing a little research on Beacon's End," Sarah explained. "Its history, the keepers who served there." "Oh, how wonderful," the librarian, whose name was Grace, exclaimed. "We have quite a bit in our local history collection. Let me show you." She led Sarah to a back room lined with filing cabinets and shelves of old newspapers bound in leather. "We've been digitizing, but we're years from finishing. Most of it's still paper, I'm afraid. But that can be nice, actually." More of an adventure. Sarah spent the next 2 hours going through files and old newspapers. She found articles about the lighthouse's construction, about storms and rescues, about the various keepers and their service. She learned that Thomas Wright had been a decorated Navy veteran who found peace at Beacon End after the war. That Helen Torres had been the first woman to serve as head keeper there, appointed in 1991, and she found information about the woman in the photograph, though it took some digging. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and she'd kept the lighthouse during World War II while her husband served in the Pacific. She'd maintained the light through storms and blackouts, had even spotted a Japanese submarine once and reported it to the Navy. A local hero, though the newspaper articles suggested she'd been modest about it all. "Just doing my duty," she was quoted as saying. "The light has to shine. That's what matters." Sarah made copies of several articles and drove back to Beacon's End as the sun set. That night, she looked at Eleanor's photograph with new understanding. A woman alone, keeping the light burning during wartime, watching for submarines instead of ships in distress. How frightened she must have been sometimes. How brave. Sarah added Eleanor's story to her logbook, wanting to preserve it, to honor it somehow. Part 4. The storm, the weather forecast called for a significant storm system moving in from the Pacific. Sarah heard about it on the radio and saw the warnings posted online. Winds up to 60 miles per hour, heavy rain, possible flooding in low-lying areas. She spent a day preparing, securing loose items around the property, checking the generator fuel, making sure she had plenty of food and water. Flashlights with fresh batteries. The lighthouse systems were designed to handle storms, but it was good to be ready. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening. The wind came first, building gradually through the afternoon until it was a constant howl around the cottage. Sarah had to put all her weight against the door to close it after bringing in a final armload of firewood. Then came the rain, not falling so much as being flung sideways by the wind. It hammered against the windows in waves, so heavy she couldn't see the ocean. The cottage creaked and groaned, but the old structure held firm. It had weathered many storms before this one. Sarah built up the fire and made soup for dinner. The power flickered once, twice, then went out. She'd expected it. The lighthouse switched to generator power automatically, and Sarah lit candles and oil lamps in the cottage. The golden light was warmer anyway, more comforting than electric bulbs. She ate her soup by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. It was fierce and wild, but she felt safe inside the sturdy walls. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, visible through the windows whenever the rain eased enough to see through. Around midnight, Sarah climbed the tower to check the systems. Everything functioned perfectly. The lamp turned, the backup generator hummed, all indicators showed green. From the lamp room, the storm was even more impressive. Wind screamed around the tower, rain lashed the glass. Waves crashed against the rocks far below, sending spray high into the air. It was terrible and beautiful at once. Raw nature, uncaring and powerful. Sarah understood why people had feared the sea and why they'd also been drawn to it. There was a truth in it, something honest and real that was hard to find in the human world. She stayed in the lamp room for an hour, watching the storm, feeling the tower sway almost imperceptibly in the strongest gusts. Not dangerous, the structure was built for this, but enough to notice. A reminder that even solid things could move, could bend, could adapt. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. Sarah dozed on the sofa, waking periodically to feed the fire or check the lighthouse. The rhythms of the storm became familiar. The roar of wind, the crash of waves, the rattle of rain. They wove themselves into her dreams. By the second evening, the storm began to ease. The wind dropped to a mere gale. The rain became intermittent. Sarah ventured outside for the first time in 30 hours, bracing against the wind, and walked down to the beach to see what the storm had brought. The tide line was littered with debris, driftwood, kelp, pieces of fishing net, shells, and stones tumbled smooth by the violent water. She walked slowly, examining things, pocketing a few particularly nice shells. And then she found it, a message in a bottle. It was half buried in the sand, a wine bottle sealed with wax. Sarah pulled it free and held it up to the fading light. There was definitely something inside, a rolled paper. Back at the cottage, she carefully removed the wax seal and worked the cork free. The paper inside was dry, protected by the seal. She unrolled it carefully. The handwriting was childish, large, and careful. My name is Emma. I am 9 years old. I live in Seattle. If you find this, please write back. I put this in the ocean on my birthday, July 15th. I hope it goes somewhere amazing. At the bottom was an email address. Sarah smiled. The message had been in the ocean for months, traveling who knew how far, and it had washed up here at Beacon's End in the storm. That evening, she composed an email to Emma describing where the bottle had been found, the lighthouse, the storm that had brought it ashore. She attached a photo of Beacon's End with the sunset behind it. 2 days later, she got a reply. Emma was thrilled. That's so cool. A real lighthouse. My mom says lighthouses are important. I'm doing my school project about your lighthouse now. Can I ask you questions? Sarah wrote back, of course, and so began a correspondence. Emma asked about the lighthouse, about the ocean, about what Sarah did all day. Sarah answered, finding joy in describing her life here to someone who found it all so fascinating. Emma sent her school project when it was done a poster board with photos and facts and a drawing of Beacon's End. I got an A. Emma wrote, my teacher said I should be a lighthouse keeper when I grow up. The message in the bottle seemed like a small thing, but it reminded Sarah that the world was still connected, even out here. That small actions could have unexpected consequences. that a child's birthday wish could travel across the ocean and back again in a different form. Part 5. Winter Light. As autumn deepened into winter, the character of the coast changed. The storms came more frequently, marching in from the Pacific one after another. The days grew short, darkness arriving by 5 in the afternoon. The lighthouse lamp burned longer, its beams sweeping through more hours of night. Sarah found she didn't mind the darkness. It was cozy in the cottage, with the fire burning and candles lit. She read more, worked on a jigsaw puzzle of the Milky Way that she'd found in a closet. She cooked elaborate meals just for herself, finding pleasure in the process. The town of Anchor Bay strung Christmas lights along the harbor in early December. Sarah drove in one evening and walked around, enjoying the festive atmosphere. The bakery had gingerbread cookies in the window. The bookstore had a small tree decorated with paper ornaments shaped like books. Grace from the library waved from across the street and came over. "How are you doing out there?" "Not too lonely?" "Not at all," Sarah said, and meant it. "I'm really enjoying it." "You're welcome to come to our Christmas Eve gathering at the community hall," Grace offered. "Nothing fancy, just cocoa and cookies and some carols." "It's nice." Sarah thanked her and said she'd think about it. She appreciated the invitation, the reminder that community was there if she wanted it. On Christmas Eve, she drove into town. The community hall was warm and bright, filled with people and the smell of pine and cinnamon. Grace introduced her around. Betty from the grocery store was there, and the bookstore owner, and dozens of others. They welcomed her easily, asking about the lighthouse, sharing their own stories of the coast. They sang carols, old familiar songs that Sarah remembered from childhood. Silent Night and Oh Come All, The Faithful and The First Noel. Voices blending, some strong and some wavering, but all sincere. Sarah felt something tight inside her loosen further, a belonging she hadn't known she'd been missing. She drove back to Beacon's End through light snow, a rarity on the coast. Fat flakes drifted down, melting as they hit the ground, but beautiful in the headlights. The lighthouse beams swept through the falling snow, each flake visible for a moment as it passed through the light. Christmas morning was quiet and peaceful. Sarah made herself a special breakfast and opened a small gift she bought herself in town, a journal with a lighthouse on the cover. She spent the afternoon writing in it, not her official logbook, but something more personal. Thoughts and observations and feelings she was only beginning to understand. The new year came with typical coastal weather, rain and wind and high seas. Sarah had been at Beacon's End for nearly 4 months now. What had seemed strange at first, the isolation, the simplicity, the endless ocean, now felt normal, good even. She thought about her old life sometimes, the job she'd quit, the apartment she'd given up, the relationship that had ended. All of it seemed very far away, like it had happened to someone else. She didn't miss it. That realization surprised her at first, but increasingly it just felt true. One January morning, walking on the beach after a storm, Sarah found a piece of sea glass. It was pale green, frosted smooth by years of tumbling in the waves. She held it up to the light, admiring how it glowed. She had found many pieces over the months, collecting them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. Blues and greens and browns, occasionally a rare piece of red or amber. Each piece had been something else once. A bottle, a jar, something useful and whole. Then broken, lost to the sea, tumbled and changed into something new. Something different, but also beautiful. Sarah thought maybe she was like that. Being broken hadn't been the end. The waves of time and change were smoothing her edges, transforming her into something new. She put the sea glass in her pocket and continued her walk, the winter sun weak but welcome on her face. Part 6. The Visitor in February. Sarah received an email from the Coast Guard. A historian was researching Pacific Northwest lighthouses and had requested permission to visit Beacon's End. Would Sarah be willing to meet with her? Sarah agreed, curious about what the historian wanted to know. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived on a clear Tuesday afternoon in a small rental car. She was in her 60s, with short gray hair and bright, intelligent eyes behind frameless glasses. She greeted Sarah warmly and immediately began exclaiming about the lighthouse. It's even more beautiful than the photographs, and in such remarkable condition. You're doing wonderful work maintaining it. Sarah gave her a tour, showing her the cottage, the tower, the lamp room. Dr. Chun took notes constantly, asked detailed questions, took hundreds of photographs. I'm writing a book about West Coast lighthouses, she explained over tea in the cottage. Their history, their architecture, their role in maritime development. Beacon's End has a fascinating story. She shared some of what she'd uncovered in her research. The lighthouse had been built after 3 ships wrecked on the rocks in a single year. A local businessman had lobbied Congress for funding, eventually succeeding. The first keeper had been a retired sea captain who survived one of those wrecks and wanted to make sure no one else suffered as he had. The human stories are what make it real, Dr. Chan said. The keepers and their families, the lives they lived here, that's what I try to capture. Sarah told her about the logbook she'd found, about Eleanor Marsh and Thomas Wright. Dr. Chun was delighted, making more notes. Would you mind if I photograph some of those logbook pages? With proper attribution, of course. They're exactly the kind of primary sources that bring history alive. Of course, Sarah said. They spent the afternoon going through the logbooks together. Dr. Chun read entries aloud, providing historical context. When Thomas Wright mentioned seeing ships headed to Korea, Dr. Chun explained about the Korean War and the military shipping lanes. When Helen Torres noted repairing storm damage in January 1993, Dr. Chun pulled up records of a particularly fierce winter that year. The past became vivid and real. These weren't just names and dates, but people living their lives, doing their work, dealing with challenges, and finding joy where they could. What about you? Dr. Chun asked as the afternoon light faded. What brings you here? If you don't mind my asking. Sarah thought about how to answer. I needed a change, she said finally. A break from my old life. Time to figure things out. And have you figured things out? Sarah smiled. Some things. I've learned I like quiet. I like being useful in a simple, clear way. I like the ocean. Will you stay after your 6 months are up? Sarah realized she'd been avoiding that question, even in her own mind. Her contract ended in April, just 2 months away. She'd have to decide soon. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm starting to think I might want to. Dr. Chun stayed for dinner. Sarah made pasta with vegetables from the farm stand, bread she'd baked that morning. They talked about lighthouses and history, about change and constants, about the things that mattered. After dinner, they climbed the tower together as the lamp came on. The beam swept across the darkening water, steady and bright. This is what it's all about, Dr. Chen said quietly. This light, for over 100 years, it's been doing exactly this. shining in the darkness, warning of danger, guiding people home. There's something profound in that consistency, don't you think? Sarah nodded. She understood exactly what Dr. Chen meant. The historian left the next morning, promising to send Sarah a copy of her book when it was published. They exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch. "Thank you," Dr. Chen said as she prepared to leave. Not just for the access to the lighthouse, but for keeping it so beautifully, for honoring its history and purpose. It matters. After she drove away, Sarah stood looking at the lighthouse for a long moment. Dr. Chen was right. It did matter. And maybe that was what Sarah had been looking for all along, something that mattered in a clear, uncomplicated way. Part 7. Spring Decisions March brought the first hints of spring. The days lengthened noticeably. Daffodils pushed up in the garden, their green shoots brave against the still cool earth. The winter rains eased to showers, and there were days, precious, beautiful days, when the sun shone warm and bright. Sarah's 6-month contract would end in mid-April. She needed to make a decision. She could extend for another 6 months, the Coast Guard had said, or she could apply for a permanent position. Beacon's End was considered a desirable posting remote, but not too remote, well maintained, with good equipment. If she wanted to stay, they'd be happy to have her, or she could leave, return to the city, find a new job, resume her old life or something like it. Sarah walked the beach every day, thinking. The question wasn't really about the lighthouse or the job. It was about what kind of life she wanted, what kind of person she wanted to be. In her old life, she'd been busy, always rushing, always behind. Success meant promotion, money, status. She'd been good at her job, but had she been happy? When she was honest with herself, the answer was no. Here she was happy. The work was simple but satisfying. The pace was slow but not boring. She had time to think, to read, to notice things. Time to be present instead of always planning the next thing. But was she hiding, running away from real life? She thought about Eleanor Marsh keeping the light during the war, about Thomas Wright finding peace here after trauma, about all the keepers who'd chosen this life, this place. Were they hiding, or were they living authentically in a way that worked for them? One afternoon, Grace from the library called. "I hope I'm not overstepping," she said, "but I heard your contract is almost up. I wanted you to know that we'd love for you to stay. You've become part of our community, whether you realize it or not." Sarah was touched. "Thank you." "That means a lot. Take your time deciding," Grace said. "Just know you have friends here if you want them." Sarah made a list, the way she used to when facing big decisions. Pros and cons, staying versus leaving. But the columns didn't help. Logic couldn't answer what was fundamentally a question of the heart. She thought about Emma, the girl whose message in a bottle had reached Beacon's End. Emma, who'd gotten an A on her project, who'd discovered a fascination with lighthouses. Small connections, small influences, maybe that was enough. Maybe making a small difference was better than making a big splash that faded quickly. The daffodils bloomed bright yellow against the gray cottage walls. Sarah worked in the garden, preparing the soil for spring planting. She bought seeds in town, tomatoes, beans, lettuce, herbs. She'd planted them almost without thinking, then realized you only plant a garden if you plan to be there for the harvest. That realization made her smile. On the first day of April, Sarah drove into town and stopped at the bookstore. The owner greeted her warmly. "I have something for you," he said, reaching under the counter. He pulled out a book, Dr. Chun's book, just published. She sent us copies and specifically asked me to save one for you. Sarah opened it. On the title page, Dr. Chun had written, "For Sarah, Keeper of the Light. Thank you for your dedication and for sharing Beacon's End with me. May you always find your way home." Sarah paged through the book. Finding the chapter on Beacon's End, there were the photographs Dr. Chun had taken. The story Sarah had shared about Eleanor and Thomas. And at the end of the chapter, a few paragraphs about Sarah herself, the current keeper maintaining the tradition of faithful service. Reading about herself in a book felt strange, but also good. She was part of the story now, part of the history. That meant something. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table and wrote an email to the Coast Guard. She'd like to extend her contract, she wrote. Not for 6 months, but permanently, if the position was available. She'd like to be the keeper of Beacon's Inn for as long as they have her. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The reply came 2 days later. They were delighted to have her. The paperwork would follow, but consider it done. Welcome aboard permanently, Keeper Mitchell. Sarah sat back in her chair and looked around the cottage, at the books on the shelves and the fire in the fireplace, at the garden visible through the window starting to come alive with spring, at the sea beyond, eternal and changing and always there. She'd made her choice. This was home now. Part 8, Summer at Beacon's End, the Oregon coast in summer was a revelation. Sarah had arrived in fall, lived through winter and spring, but summer was something else entirely. The fog still rolled in many mornings, but it burned off to reveal brilliant blue skies. The water, while never warm, was less aggressively cold. Wildflowers bloomed on the cliffs, pink and purple and yellow, nodding in the breeze. Tourists came too, of course. The lighthouse was marked on maps, and people drove out to see it. Sarah didn't mind most of the time. She gave informal tours when people asked, showing them the tower, explaining how the light worked. She pointed out whales when they breached in the distance, showed them the best tide pools. A young couple came one afternoon, newly engaged, asking if they could take pictures with the lighthouse in the background. Sarah agreed and ended up taking photos for them, capturing their joy and excitement. They thanked her profusely, saying it would mean so much to have their engagement photos at such a beautiful place. "We'll come back for our anniversary," the young man promised. "I'll be here," Sarah said, and meant it. Emma, the message in a bottle girl, came to visit with her mother in July. Sarah had invited them after months of email correspondence. Emma was exactly as Sarah had imagined, bright-eyed, curious, overflowing with questions and enthusiasm. Sarah gave them the full tour, letting Emma climb the tower and peer through the Fresnel lens. She showed her the logbooks, let her read entries from decades past. Emma's mother took photos of everything, clearly delighted by her daughter's happiness. "Thank you so much for this," she told Sarah. "When that bottle washed back with your message, it just sparked something in her. She's been obsessed with lighthouses ever since." "Maybe she'd be a keeper someday," Sarah said. Emma overheard. "Could I? Is that really a job people can have?" "It is," Sarah said, "though there aren't many of us left. Most lighthouses are automated now, but some still have keepers. If you really want it, maybe you could do it." Emma's face lit up with determination. "I'm going to." After they left, Sarah felt a warm glow. Maybe that was part of why she was here, not just to keep the light, but to inspire the next generation who might value such things. To show that you could choose a different path, a quieter life, and find fulfillment in it. The garden flourished in the long summer days. Tomatoes ripened on the vine. Lettuce and herbs provided fresh salads. Sarah learned to can and preserve, putting up jars of tomato sauce and pickled beans for the winter.